Thank you. I trust that the mics will sort themselves out. I live just down the street, and I've always wanted to, I've been struck many times by this wonderful building, and I've always wanted to come, so I really appreciate the invitation, and I feel like I've always wanted to come to Wallace Presbyterian, and I feel like it's a real ecumenical gathering, but I appreciate you making me feel at home as a Catholic by sitting on the back rows back there. I feel right at home. The dismal election of 2016 and its astonishing result have painfully exposed the deep divisions ailing our country. Yet it has also revealed, albeit somewhat less visibly, a point of profound agreement among all but the most partisan combatants. That our 200-plus year experiment in ordered liberty has come down to this: that there are people in the millions who apparently think, or more cynically pretend to think, that Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump was a good idea, is surely the most obvious among many signs that we are living through some sort of civilizational crisis. Of course, the agreement starts and ends there, because no one can agree on what sort of crisis this might be. And why should they? The great German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel famously said that philosophy is one's own time apprehended in thought. But our liberal and technological culture excludes philosophy as a form of public reason. So, when faced with a civilizational crisis, we dispatch an army of economists, sociologists, and psychologists to analyze it, and an army of journalists to report on it, never pausing to consider that the heart of our civilizational crisis may be imperceptible to the forms of reason which dominate our civilization. Thus, while the effects of this crisis are painfully felt and its manifold effects measured, its essence goes unperceived. This loss of vision and the corresponding thoughtlessness on evidence everywhere in our culture, proportional perhaps to the predominance of journalism as a thought form, lie at the heart of what the late Italian philosopher Augusto Del Noce called the new totalitarianism. Del Noce regarded this thoughtlessness, the reign of stupidity he sometimes called it, as extremely dangerous, despite its relative lack of overt violence and coercion. It is, after all, only an imperfect totalitarianism that coerces externally through violence and force of law, and this is often counterproductive. It has been known to awaken depths of soul and reservoirs of strength previously undetected because untested in those who suffer its brutality. Think Solzhenitsyn, or the famous statement of Tertullian that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. By contrast, in a perfectly absolute society, one whose rule was indeed total, no one would ever know that he was being coerced. There would simply be truths that could no longer be perceived, ideas that could no longer be thought, experiences that could no longer be had, and no one would ever know what he was missing. Now, I'm aware that this description will seem to many of you to be a little overwrought and pretty bleak. It seems inconsistent with our unprecedented prosperity and with the many personal freedoms that we obviously enjoy. And it seems obscene when we compare ourselves to the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, the murderous totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. So a term like this requires a defense, or at least an explanation, if we're going to use it. The key to understanding the so-called new totalitarianism and its peculiar way of being total is to understand just how it is new, what its novelty consists in. Unlike the authoritarian states of the last century, the new totalitarianism, as Del Noce depicts it, is not a positive political program aimed at world domination. In fact, it presents itself as the defender of freedom and democracy and a bulwark against fascism. It is rather a negative totalitarianism of dissolution or disintegration, which advances by negating every form of transcendence. The transcendence of God over the world, of eternity over time, of being over process, of nature over art, of reason and truth over historical circumstance. The new totalitarianism dominates by dissolving, precisely in the name of freedom, every form of given order that precedes our choosing. Hence the rapid disintegration and atomization of what was once culture and civil society. Every form of order save one, that is. For once all forms of transcendence are negated, political order itself becomes the transcendental horizon, the all-encompassing totality within which we live and move and have our being, and to which all meaningful public argument is referred, thus determining and disfiguring the limits of our vision, thought, and action. All of this is true, I think, but it's not the whole truth. For political order can never really be first or fundamental. Every political order presupposes and puts into effect a certain view of nature and of human nature. Otherwise, the nature and ends of government would make no sense. So, political philosophy is secondary to natural philosophy and metaphysics, perhaps not in the mind of political philosophers, but in the order of things. And the revolution in political thought in early modernity, which helped birth the American experiment, took place within a larger revolution in metaphysics and natural philosophy. Its most cherished notions, like the notion of freedom as power or possibility, reflect this revolutionary new view of nature. This new view is at bottom artificial or technological. Nature is an artifact. The distinction between nature and art is as old as philosophy itself, but now they're collapsed. Nature is an artifact, manufactured first by the gracious hand of a contriving God, and later by the gracious hand of history or natural selection. But in either event, the idea that natural things are essentially machines means that the knowledge of nature is essentially engineering. And truth, like freedom, is essentially technical possibility, which can only be determined by perpetually violating the present limits of possibility. The logic of liberal order, which exists above all to secure freedom as possibility, thus presupposes and sets in motion something like we now have: a technological society perpetually at war with given limits of every kind, whose dynamic exigencies govern us more deeply than the rule of law, and largely determine what it now means for us to think. A technological order, in other words, that has become for us a new regime of necessity. Reality within the physical sphere is reconceived in Del Noce's words as, quote, a system of forces, not of values. In the social sphere, truth and universal reason are eliminated, the one reduced to social and psychological situations administered by the social sciences, the other to empirical or quasi-empirical analysis. Argument becomes quite literally impossible because truth claims are attacked in advance as expressions of class interest, bigotry, or psychosis. Ultimate questions can no longer be posed in a public way, much less answered, because their objects, truth, human nature, innate ends given with our nature, no longer exist. The perfection of totalitarianism, then, consists not in the abolition of rights, the multiplication of which is not inversely but proportionally related to the power of the state instituted to secure them, but in the abolition of truth. Contrary to the pervasive liberal understanding shared by both the political left and the political right, freedom is not antithetical to truth, but depends on it. For it is only in seeing beyond the horizon of our liberal and technological order that we can act beyond its imminent necessities. Our freedom is in peril because reason and truth are in peril, as John Paul II and Benedict XVI so profoundly recognized. This crisis of reason, which is also interestingly related to the crisis of faith. Arguably, it now takes faith to believe in reason. This crisis obviously precedes and goes much deeper than the rise of Donald Trump and the sudden discovery of so-called fake news. It is a crisis endemic to late modernity. In fact, I'm tempted to say that it belongs to the very essence of the modern. Insofar as modernity is defined, in Stephen Gaukroger's words, by, quote, the assimilation of all cognitive values to scientific values, end quote. At any rate, it is a crisis of reason perpetuated by our most authoritative forms of reason, which reduce knowledge to empirical analysis and experimental success, which equate truth with technological possibility, which dismiss classical forms of philosophical inquiry as meaningless. It is perpetuated by the omnipresent media, now worn like a prosthetic attachment, which mediate what counts as the real world, while perpetually reducing it to an image of its two-dimensional assumptions. And it is furthered by an educational establishment increasingly committed, if I may be a bit rude, to civilizational suicide. An establishment which confuses education with ignorance by systematically excluding from consideration the great questions of human existence and systematically erasing, even from our memory, the answers that our ancestors gave to them, the intellectual and spiritual roots of our civilization. Now, if all of this sounds a bit overwrought, and I admit it's not a very pleasant picture, I would ask you to reflect on this question. Why is it, especially at this moment, when we know how to do things to ourselves and to our posterity that we do not know how to think about, when our society is frantically settling questions of the deepest truth under the guise of adjudicating contests of right, when we are rapidly redefining the fundamental realities of human nature and life, man, woman, mother, father, child. No small thing, any of this. Why is it at this moment that there is simply no such thing as a profound question in American public life? The future of Christian freedom, and indeed of human freedom, hinges on a renewal of the Christian mind. Yet, how are we to overcome a crisis of reason and truth in a society that has systematically relinquished the claim that these make upon the soul? Indeed, a society that has relinquished the soul. We're not likely to get very far by force of argument alone. Though mysteries ought to be contemplated, and things that are true ought to be said because they're true, whether anyone understands them or not. In any event, I want to suggest that we cannot really begin to recover an adequate notion of truth and an adequate notion of reason without, at the same time, or perhaps even first, recovering another feature of reality, another transcendental property of being, as the tradition has it, that is always understood to be inseparable from truth. I'm speaking, of course, of beauty. Here are the words of the great Swiss Catholic theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar at the outset of his magisterial theological aesthetics. Balthasar says, "Beauty is the word that shall be our first. Our situation today shows that beauty demands for itself at least as much courage and decision as do truth and goodness. And she will not allow herself to be separated and banned from her two sisters without taking them along with herself in an act of mysterious vengeance. We can be sure that whoever sneers at her name as if she were an ornament of a bourgeois past, whether he admits it or not, can no longer pray, and soon will no longer be able to love. When beauty ceases to be an objective reality, part of the very fabric and meaning of being, a reflection of its inner depth and integrity, then truth, as the measure of being, as the meaningfulness or the intelligibility of this depth, eventually loses its objectivity as well and becomes merely the functional. Conversely, we may hope that the rehabilitation of beauty, the rediscovery of beauty, the reinvigoration of beauty, and the renewal of art, both secular and Christian, art which aims not at pious didacticism or creative self-expression or political protest, but rather which aims to penetrate the world in order to reveal its mystery and beauty, may yet lead to the rediscovery of truth and to the overcoming of our civilizational crisis. So, what has beauty to do with the rediscovery of truth? Let me suggest three things, though this is by no means exhaustive nor even fully developed. There's a great deal more that we could say about all of them. But first, by its very nature, beauty is the visible manifestation of a hidden interior depth, and therefore of a mysterious unity that cannot be reduced simply to a complexification of quantity, or cannot be broken up, taken apart, and analyzed without destroying it. The only proper response, besides delighting in it, is to abide in and contemplate it. Now, by visible, of course, I don't just mean visible to our physical eyes, but to what we used to call the mind's eye. This is one reason why the beautiful should never be reduced to the pretty, and why beauty can often be hidden within sensible forms that appear to be ugly or disfigured, or under intelligible forms that seem to be tragic. Second, because beauty is useless. Beauty serves no other purpose but to be, and to be itself. In a society in which everything, including, sadly, increasingly, persons, are means, instruments, anything which retains the status of an end in itself, anything which is good and desirable for its own sake, anything which is good simply for the delight of it is to be cherished and is precious and treasured. And the presence of such things, however few they increasingly seem to be, tell us something fundamental about reality. Precisely in its uselessness, beauty manifests the inner integrity, the goodness, and therefore the truth of creation, which exists not first as an instrument for our use, but as something good, indeed very good, in itself and in the eyes of God. Beauty, therefore, reveals something fundamental about the nature of reality, fundamental about the nature of the reality that is creation, something which should elicit from us a stance not simply of domination, but adoration. And finally, because of its effect on the soul, which wounds before it delights. There is nothing like a good shock of pain, says C.S. Lewis's Puddleglum, for dissolving certain kinds of magic. An encounter with true beauty, especially perhaps as it is revealed through tragic or misshapen forms, inflicts a wound upon the soul. It's a wound that breaks us open and forces us to see that to which we had hitherto been blind. Beauty thus opens us to depths both in the world and in the soul itself that are otherwise invisible to the eyes of our reigning instrumentalism and empiricism, which can see only surfaces. I'd like to conclude by reflecting on an example from American literature that I think illustrates much of what I'm talking about. And the example that I have is Our Town, the classic play by Thornton Wilder, which I find devastatingly beautiful no matter how many times I see it or read it. Incidentally, and perhaps as a public service announcement, my family and I recently saw a splendid production of this play at the Annapolis Shakespeare Company. It's finished with its run now, but the Annapolis Shakespeare Company, which probably does not receive quite the attention of some of its sisters in Washington, is actually fantastic. I really recommend you keeping up with what's going on there. But we saw a fantastic production of the play, and the very fact that this play continues to get such a run year after year gives me hope that perhaps all is not lost and is not as bleak as the picture that I've painted. In any event, I presume that you are most of you are familiar with the play. It gives us an inside view of a slice of early 20th century history in an ordinary New England town. Our town could be, and indeed is meant to be, any town. I grew up in a small town a lot like this, which is probably one of the reasons why the play really resonates with me. These notions of an inside view and a brief slice of history are important ones. They're crucial to the meaning of the play. Because one of the important contrasts that the play sets up, and the same juxtaposition appears in a very different way in Wilder's Bridge of San Luis Rey, if you're familiar with it, is the contrast between what we might call a horizontal, empirical, external knowledge of superficial facts and a vertical, interior knowledge of depths. The former are exemplified by the experts, which the stage manager drags out at the beginning of Act 1 to educate us about the town of Grover's Corners. A professor from a nearby college who gives a geological history of the area and its migration patterns since the Neolithic era, and the editor of the town newspaper who gives us a census-like demographic summary of the place. The latter, the vertical, inside, transcendent view, is symbolized by an odd letter to one Jane Crowfoot and recounted by young Rebecca Gibbs, sister to George, who is one of the play's main protagonists. The letter is addressed to Jane Crofut, the Crofut Farm, Grover's Corners, Sutton County, New Hampshire, United States of America, continent of North America, Western Hemisphere, the universe, the solar system, excuse me, I have those backwards, the solar system, the universe, the mind of God. What we begin to see in this juxtaposition is that from the horizontal empiricist point of view, represented by the journalist and the professor, each of these slices of time look pretty much like any other. Grover's Corners and its citizens look like the families living in ancient Babylon, which once numbered 2 million people. They buy and they sell. They get married, they have children, and they die. Destined to be unremembered by history, except perhaps as some sort of anonymous fact in professors telling of the migration history of the area. This is one of the ways that our town really is any town. From this point of view, they're more or less the same, quantitatively different. But from the vertical point of view, from the eternal vantage point, which sees within as well as without, each of these otherwise anonymous statistical instances is a life dense and dramatic and saturated with meaning too weighty and too beautiful for us mortals to bear. We get a glimpse from this point of view in the final act, in the play's famous graveyard scene. There we encounter young Emily Webb, who has died during childbirth, received into the company of friends and neighbors who have gone before her. Throughout the play, we have watched Emily grow into a woman. We have seen her as a young girl, pleading with her mother to reassure her that she was pretty. We have watched as she and the boy next door, George Webb, flirted with each other from their bedroom windows. We have watched their awkward high school courtship and the joy and the terror of their wedding day. The terror part is really funny. And now, with George lying prostrate in the rain before Emily's gravestone, we find Emily on the other side of the veil, longing wistfully to relive just one day of her old life with the benefit of the understanding that she has acquired in death. Her neighbors and her mother-in-law plead with her not to return. She doesn't really understand as well as she thinks she does. She is undaunted, but at least they prevail upon her not to return for her wedding day or for the birth of a child, but for an unimportant day. Choose the least important day, Mother Gibbs tells her. It will be important enough. Emily chooses her 12th birthday. She returns only to discover that the living cannot see what she sees, that we apparently do not see much at all. She pleads silently with her mother to look at her, to really look at her, as she had once pleaded with her to look at her and to tell her that she was pretty, and to understand what the question really meant. But her mother's busy and oblivious. Forlorn, she declares, I can't go on. It goes so fast. We don't have time to look at one another. She breaks down sobbing and decides to return to the other side, saying, I didn't realize. So all that was going on and I never noticed. Do any human beings ever realize life while they live it? Every minute? No, replies the omnipresent stage manager who hovers over and haunts the play. Then pausing, he adds, the saints and poets, maybe, they do some. Wilder's beautiful play unveils depths that are invisible to all of our predominant forms of reason. The beauty of this story wounds us, and it forces us to see and to remember just how densely saturated this life is with beauty and with meaning. It reminds us, as all great philosophies have, and as Christianity does, to live our lives remembering our deaths. It shows us the poverty of what passes for knowledge. And it helps us to see the blessing inherent in our finitude, the mercy in what we can't see, the gift of our blindness, which is due not just to our sin, but also to our limits, our God-given limits. If we truly understood the full weight and meaning of our every action, if we truly understood what we were doing, if we knew all the ways that the downstream consequences of this or that thoughtless act, the way they hurt people, the good effects they have, if we knew the full weight of all of this, we couldn't bear it. In unveiling these mysteries with such beauty, Wilder unveils something of the truth of our existence, but only from that vertical point of view. But he also reveals something about the vocation of any true artist, which Flannery O'Connor, speaking of the novelist, calls prophetic. His kind of vision, O'Connor writes, is prophetic vision. Prophecy, which is dependent on the imaginative and not the moral faculty, need not be a matter of predicting the future. The prophet, rather, is a realist of distances. And it is this kind of realism that goes into great novels. It is the realism which does not hesitate to distort appearances to show a hidden truth. Let us pray that God will send us such prophets, these realists of distances, for genuine human freedom, not just the freedom to choose from infinite possibilities, which is oftentimes merely, in the end, the freedom of a spasm, but the freedom to know and to embrace and to even suffer for the truth. This freedom cannot survive without their vision, and we will need a good deal more of them if we hope to overcome our civilizational crisis and the reign of stupidity which characterizes the new totalitarianism. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, if you can raise your hand. I think we have someone bringing a microphone around to you. Perhaps.
Am I still on?
Yes, Jamie.
Hi, that was a great talk, thanks.
Thank you.
You mentioned that beauty is objective, and I'm wondering if you can say a little more about that. How would we define beauty among other competing definitions, and what is it that makes beauty objective rather than subjective?
Right. Great question. I don't actually love the language of objectivity, to be honest with you. It's got all kinds of problems. But what I mean by that is what the classical and Christian tradition always meant by that there were what were called, in sort of technical philosophical parlance, the transcendental attributes of being, which were thought to be interchangeable with one another, which is the qualities that describe being as such. Unity. Anything you perceive as a unity of some kind, for instance. Anything that exists has to exist as a kind of unity. Truth, goodness, beauty, are characteristic of reality, as opposed to simply being meanings that for some random and irrational reason originate in here and we project on a meaningless world. In that contrast between that two views, two sort of fundamental metaphysical decisions, and in many ways, I think the whole history of thought can, in a sense, be reduced to a choice between these two. Either meaning and therefore beauty is intrinsic to reality. Either it is real. In other words, either there is a logos, a word, at the foundation of reality, or there isn't, in which case meaning is premised upon unmeaning. A great many of our problems stem from the fact, social, political, existential, you name it, stem ultimately from the fact that in this metaphysical revolution that I described, we moved from the former to the latter. It's hard to get up in the morning in a meaningless universe. It's hard to find a reason. Now, to say that goodness is a quality of or an attribute of being simply is to say that in a certain sense it can't be defined, because being can't be defined. It's not, as Aristotle says, being's not a genus. It's not one kind of thing. It's what everything that is partakes of. So in a certain sense, being defies definition, or beauty defies definition. But I think we can describe it or give it a kind of quasi-definition by saying that it is the sort of visible showing forth, the splendor, if you will. And John Paul II had an encyclical by this name, Veritatis Splendor. It is the splendor of the truth of reality. It's the truth of reality in its showing itself and in its attractiveness. And that's why it has the effect upon us that it does. Does that approach your question?
Yeah, so I mean, if I'm hearing you right, what you're saying is that we need to kind of go back to a pre-modern definition of beauty. The Enlightenment really messed this up.
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
That would have, should have just said so. Yeah. My wife often says that, if you ask me what time it is, I'll tell you how to make a watch. Sometimes I get, 5-gallon questions and give 20-gallon answers. I apologize for that. But no, I mean, in a certain sense, the problem has to do, in the book by Del Noce that I quoted, I mean, not all of this comes from him. I'm sort of interweaving some things I've learned from him recently with my own thought and things I've learned from others. But, the title of the book that this comes from is The Crisis of Modernity. I mean, and we don't ask ourselves often enough, what is it? What does the essence of modernity consist in? Or what makes the modern era modern? It implies a differentiation. It implies a self-differentiation, understanding ourselves over against what came before. Here's the 20 gallons. I'll stop in a second. Yep. Or understanding ourselves over against what came before. What came before?
Thanks.
So, sure.
Do we have another question? Yes.
How do you understand imagination?
How do I understand imagination? Oh, that is a fascinating question. I'm not sure I do. But what I think imagination is not is simply the modern faculty for making stuff up. And this, your question actually takes one into a whole thicket of really interesting philosophical and metaphysical questions. I mean, for instance, is knowledge or truth something we discover, or something we create, or is it both? I mean, the notion of invention, etymologically speaking, the notion of invention means a coming into, which implies a kind of discovery. For us, it means fabricating something new. It seems to me, I mean, one of the ways I understand that I would want to try and answer your question is the place at which we encounter, I mean, in an older fashion sense, this would be the place whereby the images that the world communicates to us are taken up. That would be kind of an Aristotelian sense of the imagination. But it would be, I would want to say that it's the place at which we meet the world, where the world takes up residence in us, where we make a home for it in ourselves. But in doing so, we give something back, and something creative. So, when I invent something, when Thornton Wilder, I mean, it's interesting to think about that question, for instance, through the lens of what it means to do something like write Our Town. And it seems to me, on the one hand, he's inventing this town. He's inventing this town. He's inventing these characters. He's inventing this story. And yet, at the same time, in the very invention, he's discovering some fundamental truths built into the very fabric of reality. Imagination is, I think, where that happens. Would be my off the top of the head, back of the napkin attempt to answer that.
Do we have another question? Yes.
Oh.
Why is imagination important to me?
Why is it important to you?
Why do I need imagination?
Because you're human, and it's integral to living a full and rich human life. I mean, for one thing, it's not an option. It's not a thing that we can, it's not a thing that we can really do without and remain ourselves. But it seems to me that it's a necessary organ, if you will, for perceiving and enjoying what God has given us to know, which is Himself.
You started with the disorder and ugliness of our political situation and ended with the goodness of beauty. How do we make our political situation beautiful?
Oh golly, that might be the hardest one yet. And I can think of all kinds of flippant answers to give to that. But it's not. It's a serious question. I think it's very important to distinguish and to know the difference between hope and optimism. And I think a great deal of the trouble with American Christianity, from the late 19th century on, Catholic, Protestant, left and right, is that it has confused those things. Partly for that reason, partly because of something I tried to suggest in my talk, namely that political order tends to define the limits of our horizon and our imagination and our vision. We stake a great deal of hope on deliverance or salvation by politics. I'm not optimistic about that. For a number of reasons. I mean, and it's not just the poor quality of the candidates and the increasingly poor quality we seem of the candidates that we seem to have. It's not just that collegiality has broken down, fragmentation and social dissolution is taking place, and we're really seeing it. But it's also, to me, I'm concerned that the technological society that I described, this society that has instituted a process that has taken on a life of its own, is not governable in the end. And that in a way it is more, its dynamisms are more determinative than our political action. Which means that if that's true, and and none of that is to counsel, is A, to counsel despair, or B, to suggest that we should therefore withdraw from engagement in the political sphere and not do what we can to make the world better, to defend the innocent and the weak, to provide a livable standard of living for everyone that we can. None of those things. I'm not gainsaying any of that. But what it does mean is that we need, I think, to refocus the object of our hope, or rediscover where our true hope lies. And the gentleman asked before about the imagination. I don't think we can rediscover where our true hope lies unless we can begin to see beyond those horizons, unless we can begin to liberate our imaginations from being defined by the necessities and the limits of our political order. And what is necessary for all of that is understanding. Something that we don't have much use for sometimes because it isn't always that immediately that useful. All of that's really why I say, that the future of Christian and human freedom depends upon a renewal of the Christian mind. I mean, we really, we have a lot of thinking to do and a lot of understanding to try and do. And part of what I was trying to get at in this talk is that real artists and real art has an indispensable role to play in helping to bring that about. So one of the ways, I suppose, and again, sorry for the 20-gallon answer, one of the ways, I suppose, to attempt to make our political system more, or our politics more beautiful is simply to rediscover the beauty which makes us more beautiful. I mean, that sounds like a Hallmark card, and I don't mean for it to, but something like that.
I think we have time for one more question. Oh, maybe two more.
Thank you. Yeah, I had a question. You said something about how beauty as a concept is something that is and should not necessarily be kind of examined and analyzed. And I'm just curious how you reconcile this very kind of cerebral idea of beauty with the kind of practical reality of artist communities spend years of their lives analyzing literature, analyzing artwork, and so how does it translate? You have this concept of beauty that should not be analyzed, when in order to construct things that are beautiful, we must do that exact thing.
There was some kind of an acoustical glitch, and maybe it's on the receiving end, but I didn't get all of that. I'm sorry, I was trying to make faces that would indicate.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So the question was, you talked about beauty as something that should be kind of absorbed, but not necessarily taken out and analyzed, whereas people, artists, authors, that sort of thing, spend years of their lives doing that exact thing in order that they may construct things that are beautiful. So how do you reconcile this kind of abstract idea of beauty with the practical reality of creating things that are beautiful?
Oh, that's a great question. That puts me on the spot. There's a lot, I think, involved in answering it. I mean, first of all, I would want to sort of flip the notions of the concrete and the abstract. A flower that blooms as a whole is a concrete thing. A flower with its petals dissected from one another and hashed up under a microscope and examined is an abstract thing. It involves the literal meaning of abstraction, a pulling apart or taking out. So, I would want to call, there's an interesting question about what we mean by concrete and what we mean by abstract, first of all. But there are also different kinds of abstraction, and abstraction is not wicked. It's neither wicked nor optional, right? I mean, in a certain sense, the act of attention is a form of abstraction. In this room right now, in order to have this conversation with you, there's a sense in which I have to focus on you and to let everything else that's actually going on and upholding us and sustaining us and the whole actuality in which we find ourselves recede into the background. And in a certain sense, our conversation involves a kind of abstraction insofar as it involves sort of focusing on a part of the whole. Doing that is what it means to know discursively. So it's not as if abstraction is wicked, but part of the problem is certain kinds of abstractions that we have involve breaking things. Breaking things, taking them apart, putting them back together. Our experience being one of those things. And generally speaking, when one does that and you add the parts back together, they never add up to the original whole that you broke in the first place. That doesn't mean we don't do that. That doesn't mean, for instance, we should stop scientific experiments. But what it does mean, although I'd like to think more deeply about them, but what it does mean is that we need to attend more closely to what we're doing. So certainly I'm not opposing, if you're speaking of this not from the point of view of the scientist, but from the point of view of the artist, and what it takes, the kinds of skills, the kinds of minute skills, the kinds of minute forms of attention that are required, for instance, to be able to render something. I don't at all object to that. I just not sure I would just describe it in that way. But B, it seems to me that does involve both, in reality, whether we acknowledge or not, but in a way that we ought to acknowledge if we want to understand ourselves better, a certain way of attending to the whole. We don't know what to do with wholes because we think wholes are not wholes but sums. In a way, part of what I was trying to hint at with that was the difference between a whole and a sum. So I don't know if that answers the question. It's a really good question. I'd like to go off and think about it, but and I will, but you won't get the benefit of that. Is there one more?
We'll take one more question.
So you talked about how beauty was inherent in reality and not something that we impose in it. But if that's true, if beauty is something that's inherent in reality, then why do we need art? What does that bring to the table? Why can't we just say the heavens declare the glory of God and leave it at that?
Oh, that's a good question too. The scholastics, Thomas Aquinas, has a, I guess, I'm reluctant to call it a slogan, but a saying that's repeated over and over again in the tradition, that grace does not destroy nature, but perfects it. The distinction between nature and art is, as I mentioned in the lecture, really as old as philosophy itself. It goes back, it's present in Plato, and Aristotle makes a great deal of it and generates from that another quote-unquote slogan, which is art imitates nature. That means a couple of different things. Negatively, it means that as an imitation, art lacks something that nature has. or that a natural thing is something that an artifact is not. You know, one of the obvious differences, the places where we see that difference is in the difference between someone and something, for instance. You know, your iPad, however complex you make it, I think we'd all be reluctant to ever say that it is someone, although many of us unfortunately have that kind of a relationship with it. It remains a thing, and there's an infinite difference there. So, in a way, the distinction between art and nature marks the distinction between two different ways of being a thing. That's the negative sense. But in the positive sense, it also means that art can help us to understand. You know, that an art imitating nature means that some of the things that characterize nature, for instance, an inner integrity, a goodness in itself, a beauty, those things can belong to art as well. And I would in fact go on to say that not only can they belong to art as well, but they can belong to art in a way that's in such a way that art stands in this relation to nature similar to that of grace, perfecting it or bringing it to realize inner possibilities that it can't realize on its own. You know, regardless of what Richard Dawkins says about monkeys banging on typewriters, eventually, given worlds enough and time, you know, knocking out the genetic code, it's not likely that any pile of stones will ever assemble themselves into Gaudi's Sagrada Familia, for instance. And yet that's a capacity, in a certain sense, to bring those stones into the worship of God and to make them further glorify God, based beyond what they can do for themselves. I mean, human beings are, I still believe, you know, the apex of creation. You know, we were given this world to tend for the glory of God. And therefore, you know, art isn't, well, for one thing, it's indispensable. I mean, it's not, it doesn't define the human essence, but it belongs very closely to it as one of its very first effects. I mean, it's very hard to imagine humans ever having been humans. As long as we know on any scale of man being man, he's been a user of tools. And so his life from the very beginning has been inseparable from the world that he has helped to fabricate for himself through the buildings of homes and cities and so forth. There's something about making, human making, that belongs very close to the imago Dei in us. And that is not just an act of violence upon the world, it also brings the world more deeply into a participation in the life of God, I think.
Would you please join me in thanking Dr. Hanby for coming tonight?
Thank you all. I've enjoyed this very much.